Welcome to the Daily Objective, day 145 of the war in Israel. I'm joined by Morgan. How's it going, Morgan? I know that
Not
the reality show that follows that there's
too bad,
this is
Rosie. I've been looking forward to doing this one.
sorry, I just caught what you said. There's some sort of a delay, maybe. But all right,
You've caught up now, I think. Sorry.
all right. So yeah, the reality show's title will be controversial, and we'll be talking about that. But I think this show's title might be a bit problematic as well because democratic Islamism inside Britain's jihadist constituency. The latter part of that suggests that Britain has just one Islamist constituency, which of course we know of the 635 constituencies, parliamentary constituencies in the UK. There's more than one with a strong Islamic element, but we are talking about one specific one, and our American audience will have heard in the past decade or so of this idea of democratic socialism, which is a way of trying to make socialism sound less abhorrent than it actually is. And with Islamism, although nobody actually uses democratic Islamism among the Islamists. That is what it is, and it is something that is also important, and we should pay close attention to. The reason we're talking about this, we're talking about Rochdale in England, and the reason we're talking about Rochdale is because they have a by-election. Uh, their sitting member of parliament passed away, and now there is an election on who will replace him. The winner of that election, by the way, will have that seat for several months. We don't know how many, but a general election is coming no later than January of next year, but most likely in the fall of this year. So, Morgan, what can you tell us just generally about Rochdale and about this by-election, and are we fair to the people of Rochdale in calling them the jihadist constituency?
Well, maybe. I mean, we'll get to that. Rochdale's a town that has a fascinating history. I hope, by the way, that I'm not lagging out just as I was at the beginning. Just let me know if we do. So during the 19th century, it was one of the real industrial hubs of the UK and one of the towns that really led the Industrial Revolution. And that's reflected actually in its electoral history, where it elected a huge number of radicals and liberals in favor of free markets. So one of them, who I really admire, is this guy called Richard Cobden, who was the representative for Rochdale. And he was one of the guys, in the sense, who did the most to promote laissez-faire capitalism in the UK ever. He's one of the founders of the Anti-Corn Law Leagues. His name is on the Cobden Chevalier Treaty, which is a free trade deal with France, and so on. So that it has actually a very interesting history. In the 20th century, you see a decline from the wealth and the industrialism that's there as industry at home declines, often moves abroad, and so on. That typical kind of story of decline in the North. And so it becomes increasingly poor, increasingly ravaged by social issues, antisocial behavior, domestic violence, teenage pregnancies, drug use, all that kind of thing, to the point where Rochdale now isn't the most attractive town that you might like to live in. And in particular, in relation to our title, at least since the early 2000s, there's been a large influx of a Muslim population. So the population, I don't know exactly by Muslim, but of the percentage of the population that's Asian is something around 17%, which is much higher than the national average at the moment. So there's a large minority of the population there. Whether then, based on 17%, you want to say it's the Islamist constituency, not quite based on that, but I think based on who they might elect to parliament in this by-election, you might consider it that way. So that's some of the history. When I used to live in Manchester, Rochdale was not a place that I would like to hang out, and it's not a place that anyone, I think, really would love to live in. It's a place that you have to live in. Um,
Um, Now, for this by-election, this coming Thursday, so George Galloway is the favorite to win. We talked about this. I haven't seen any polls, but I have seen the bookies in the UK. You can bet on elections, and they usually know why they offer the odds that they offer, and they offer the clearest favorite is George Galloway. And I think we'll talk about him a lot in the coming days, assuming he's going to win. We'll talk about him. We'll dedicate an episode to him as we do to his kind. I want to start with the Labor candidate, or not really Labor candidate, Azhar Ali. So
Yeah.
he is no longer the Labor candidate because he said that Israel allowed the October 7th attack to happen so that they would have a justification for the war. Now, um, I don't know where to start with this, but I will start with the fact that this is kind of a thing we see with the pro-Palestinian anti-Semitic propaganda, which is if you have knowledge of Israel intentionally allowing October 7th to happen, you should bring those facts to light. But if you're running in Rochdale, I guess you don't need to bring the fact. You need to make that statement. And the fact, we're used to elections where the issues and the positions people take on the issues are unfortunate, let's say. People argue about who's going to spend more money in the UK on the NHS. In the US, they argue about trade wars and restricting immigration. In Rochdale, seemingly, in order to win, you need to convince the people that you are the person who is the most anti-Jewish or anti-Israel. So and Azhar Ali, had a good a pretty good run at that with this statement that had nothing on his end to back it up. Not even these bits and pieces that conspiracy theorists make up. He just made up the point and left it at that. What I found interesting is you say Israel let it happen, the Palestinians still did it. Like even if you had proof of your claim, the people you support are these savage rapists and murderers. And but of course, with well, uh, people who support the Palestinians know that as well as their politicians. Morgan, your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I mean that's a good point you made just at the end there. That what's interesting about these kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and I'll qualify why I think it's just that it's anti-Semitic, it's not just anti-Israel, quote unquote, is that they're never genuinely explanatory of what's going on, as you pointed out. So Azhar Ali, he isn't the official Labour candidate, but it's worth pointing out to people that it's a kind of limbo. So he was deselected after the nominations came in, so he will appear on the ballot paper with his name next to the Labour, the Labour Party, but he's no longer actively campaigning, and I suspect he wouldn't take up his seat even if he were voted in. And so people probably aren't going to vote for him. So he's basically out. The Green Party candidate is out as well for having a tweet back in 2013 where he said that the Quran is incompatible with the 21st century. Shocking, I know, but there you go. The guy who might beat Galloway is a guy called Simon Danchuk, who used to be the Labour candidate between 2010 and 2017, when he was not selected to run again over a scandal with a text sent to a young lady. So he might win. There's been a death threat against him for being a white man, which has been reported to the police and has gotten some news coverage recently as well. And then Galloway, who's standing for the Workers' Party, which is a party of his own founding, and which is a party which was founded on its own website. It says to celebrate and preserve the achievements of the USSR, China, and Cuba. So that just gives you a little picture of all of that.
Yeah, by the way, Simon Danchuk sent a text not to a young woman, to a teenage girl.
Yes, yeah,
But
yeah,
and yeah, Simon Danchuk is interesting also because if you look at his history, he is very much pro-Palestinian. He's been to Gaza. He's you know, and he is the right-wing candidate in this election. So this is just to give you a sense of what Rochdale is. He is the candidate of the party that was started by Nigel Farage, right? Um,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So this is the focus of UK politics at the moment. There's nobody who is really giving a counterpoint to the pro-Palestinian consensus in that constituency. By the way, thanks Thanks, Jonathan, for the super chat. Thanks, Robert, for pointing out that in American English, it's called a special election, not a by-election, in case anybody got confused over that. And yeah, George Galloway is something that Americans, probably at least my age and older, might remember, because he came to America to speak to Congress about how evil America is for removing his close buddy Saddam Hussein from power, and yeah, his entire political career has been built around anti-Semitism, anti-Israel. He once walked off a press conference because an Israeli asked him a question. His campaign poster is a flag of the PLO, or what people like to call the Palestinian flag. So, and this is the guy who, again, is very likely to win, because, as far as I can tell, the people don't think that blaming the Jews for their murder is anti-Jewish enough. So Rochdale is a very poor place, right? It's one of the poorest constituencies in the UK. That wasn't always the case. So I don't know much about that, so I'm going to go to you, Morgan, hoping you do. But yeah.
Well, as I say, so in the 19th century, it was a hub for industrialism, manufacturing, textiles, all this kind of stuff that Manchester was associated with. So, I mean, so Rochdale is in the Greater Manchester area. So often when people talk about the wealth of Manchester, although it's focused in other places and in the city centre itself, Rochdale is often kind of roped into that. So Rochdale, although coming into the Industrial Revolution, like a lot of towns in the UK, was very poor, its wealth skyrocketed immensely, and you get a number of these wealthy industrialist types coming up. And so, although Richard Cobden, for example, just to go back to him, was a politician, he was an industrialist himself and a campaigner for free trade. So he was one of these new money types. So yeah, so it used to be rich, and it's declined like a lot of the north of England has, unfortunately, and it's stuck in this kind of stagnation. And it's probably most famous, at least within the UK, and I think this got coverage outside the UK for the grooming gang scandal, which came out in the last 10 years. And that was particularly surrounding an instance of men from the Muslim community who were sexually exploiting, so raping, I'm going to say, I don't want to euphemize it, young girls who were white. And the reason why I specified that they were white is not because I want to be tribal about it, is because they were particularly preyed on for that reason. They were perceived by these men as being sort of Western Jezebels with loose morals and so on. And these were young women from vulnerable backgrounds, troubled families who were raped and abused in a way that's terrible, and which was not investigated properly, as we find out, by the police, for fear of being perceived as racist, for being perceived as persecuting the Muslim community in those areas. And that's something that we discovered more widely has gone on in other towns in the UK, but Rochdale was sort of the epicenter of that discovery. So that's why, unfortunately, the current state of Rochdale in the modern day.
Yeah, and by the way, when it did come out, people pointing it out were still accused of racism, and you know, the way the conversation is going on in Rochdale still seems like, you know, if you criticize these people, you're going to be accused of racism, of Islamophobia, which, you know, we've talked about as a term should not be used because it's not valid in any usage. It's not a valid concept. Um, yeah, so with George Galloway being the again the likely winner and the likely member of Parliament. George Galloway, by the way, is also a former Labour member of Parliament. He's also he was kicked out of Labour for being, I believe it was for being too anti-Semitic, right? Which you know, nowadays happens a bit more post Jeremy Corbyn, but wasn't a regular thing. Like anti-Semitism has been a built-in part of the Labour Party for a long time. And so to get kicked out, you need to go further than a just normal threshold of decency. And then he started his own party called Respect. Um, I don't know what happened to that, but now he is representing the Workers' Party because, and again, the people of Rochdale, being poor as they are, seem to think that the solution to their poverty might be, socialism, because we know how well that worked out everywhere else. But are they really voting because of their poverty, or are they voting because of their anti-Semitism?
Well, I think it's certainly a factor which we have to consider. So yes, Galloway is representing the Workers' Party, which is campaigning on a platform of defending the legacy of the Soviet Union. He said that the greatest disaster that happened in his lifetime was the collapse of the Soviet Union. For people who don't know George Galloway, that's the lovely guy we're dealing with. And as you say, big pals with Saddam Hussein, famously gave him the compliment of saluting, I think was it his bravery, his spirit, and his indefatigability, something like that. Um, so that's George Galloway. And so then after leaving Parliament, yeah, he campaigned for the Respect Party. He also founded some other small party for local Scottish politics that also folded. I think Respect has folded as well. I don't think it exists anymore. Um, and so then he was hosting a television channel on Russia Today. And then once he could no longer do that, he's been hosting it on his YouTube channel. And I was sort of blissfully happy that he had um, been kind of just gently pushed away from the mainstream of British political life. And yet, unfortunately, it seems like there's the perfect storm of circumstances in this by-election to thrust him back. And if he wins in this by-election, although it's a comforting thought to imagine he might only be back for 6 months. If they vote for him this time, why won't they vote for him again? So it's possible that it's a return to mainstream politics for him. So that's George
Yeah, by
Galloway.
the way, I remember when he won, was it Bradford West, where that he represented before, last time
I can't
he
remember. I can't remember. He used to be an MP for Glasgow, but maybe for Bradford as well. I can't remember.
and wherever it was, the other candidate was also, and that was a Labour candidate, was also very much running on a get rid of Israel ticket. And Happy Avocado asked here, why do these guys not go live in Islamabad? Well, because they want to turn this country into Islamabad. Islamabad is already Islamabad, and other shithole Muslim countries are already what they are, but Britain still has remnants of what it once was, and until they are destroyed, there is no reason for them to go anywhere else. Let me read some of what he says here, because I think he was asked about chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And he says, I don't regard it as anti-Semitic. I don't, so I can say it. This is a free country. Interesting point to make. I'm in favor of a democratic state for Jews, Muslims, and Christians between the river and the sea. You may not like that. Others may not like that, but that's what I believe, and we'll see if people vote for that. So we know what a democratic country between the river and the sea means. He's for a one-state solution where the Jews no longer exist, because there has been a democracy between the river and the sea in the non-Israel part, the part that wasn't controlled by Israel, in which those who don't vote in Israeli elections got to vote, and they voted for Hamas. They voted for what the people who they knew back then would do on October 7th if they could. And yeah, a democracy. If there's a one state right now and it's a democracy, and of course I'm sure he supports the right of return to anybody who self-identifies as a Palestinian refugee, then there will be one election in that democracy, and the rest we already know from the history as we've seen it in Europe.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I didn't actually answer your previous question, which was, are they supporting him for the anti-Semitism? And whilst I can't get inside their minds, I can make an inference based on whether George Galloway is an anti-Semite. And so with Galloway, he will explicitly deny that he's an anti-Semite and will do so passionately. And there are people who are, unfortunately, I don't want to be unkind, but simple-minded enough that's as far as they need to think about it, as far as they're concerned. He says he's against anti-Semitism. Doesn't matter what else he says or what else he does. So what people need to do when he's denying that he's an anti-Semite is look at his other opinions and what else he's supporting, what else he's doing, and does that add up with that opinion? Could you actually consistently support the people he supports? Could you go to Syria and praise jihadists and martyrs if you weren't an anti-Semite, for example? But could you do that if you weren't an anti-Semite? And one of the things that's important to notice. He'll say, so I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm an anti-Zionist. I want to criticize Israel. The person he walked off the stage with, which I think you're remembering, by the way, was actually Eilon Levy when he was a student in a debate. So Eilon Levy was getting ahead of the curve whilst he was even just a student. But so he'll say, I'm anti-Israel, I'm not anti-Semitic. And what's important to think about when people are making that kind of distinction, which they make all the time, is that anti-Semitic tropes have a really long history in Western culture, and particularly in the culture of the UK. And what's interesting when people start alleging criticisms of Israel, like Galloway, is that their criticisms take the same kind of shape that the anti-Semitic tropes did. So it'll things that Israel is very powerful. Israel has an unusually large influence. One of the things he alleged against Israel was that they were engaging in false flag operations against the Syrians to malignly persecute the Syrians, right? And so it's important to notice that the anti-Israel rhetoric takes the same form as the anti-Semitic rhetoric. And Dave Rich has a really lovely line about this in his book, that it's like handholds in a mountain that have been worn in over time by previous climbers, and that when people approach this same thing, they just take the same kind of route. And so the racists figured out a long time ago that if they, on the surface of it, deny that they're racist and say the right things, then there's a chunk of the population that will consider that plausible enough to ignore all the other things that they're saying and doing and the implications of it. Why is he so does he have such an animus against Zionism, for example, as compared to other nationalisms? Is it really in proportion? If it's not, why is it going over the top in proportion to other kind of nationalisms that he's not annoyed about, and so on and so forth? And so I think from these kind of things, from the people he supports, the Islamist groups, I think we can infer that he is an anti-Semite, no matter what he explicitly says, denying that. And for the people in Rochdale, if they do elect him, I have to say, why don't they care about that? Why does that not just instantly disqualify him in their minds? I appreciate they're in a rubbish situation with the candidates they've been given, but the Conservative candidates there, the Conservative Party is rubbish, and they could vote for the Reform UK guy. I know that he seems a bit odd himself, but they really could do that. They don't have to vote for George Galloway, and if they do, they at least don't care about anti-Semitism enough to not elect him. That's the best thing you could say for them. And actually, we know that amongst lots of Muslim populations in the UK, anti-Semitic attitudes are not uncommon. So it's a plausible belief, I think.
Yeah, that's generous, not uncommon. No, well, anti-Semitism is the norm in Muslim communities in this country, elsewhere, and yeah, as you mentioned, historically, it's not like the Nazis had no explanation of why they were going after the Jews. I mean, Hitler wrote a book, about half of which was about that. So there have always been reasons and explanations, and as do all bigots, for whatever their bigotry, there's a reason for it in their mind and in their in their rhetoric. So yeah, this is why it's important when they try to get away from this and try, and of course they, as we'll be talking about in the reality show, they always will find their token Jews that they can wave around, like the British National Party when a court forced them to allow non-whites as members on the day that decision had been made and implemented. I remember there was a black person who signed up and said how proud he was, and they were happy to have him because look, we're not racist. And by the way, the anti-Semites today didn't really accept that argument when it came to the British National Party and the one black member on the first day that they could have non-white people, but they do accept it when, of course, when it comes to them. One thing I'd like to point, because I don't think we mentioned this, but if you look at the thumbnail for today's episode, that is George Galloway with Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas. I believe he is the leader. That's when so he was prime minister after Hamas was elected, and then there was the whole uh, kind of separation between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, or at least Hamas and Fatah. So Hamas took Gaza, but he presented Galloway with an honorary citizenship for his support of the Palestinian cause. And the Palestinian cause, again, if you're not taking our word for it, the fact is that if the leader of Hamas sees George Galloway as a supporter of the Palestinian cause, and the Palestinian cause as implemented by Hamas is October 7th. Uh, what more do you need? And if you need more, nothing in the world will convince you, I think, of where this person stands.
Well, there are people, again, who unfortunately who are simple enough to see that George Galloway is on the left and think, therefore, he could never be a racist, obfuscating the history of the fact that it was Oswald Mosley who was in the first Labour government ever, and was a Labour government minister who founded the British Union of Fascists. And also, I mean, he's an interesting comparison in a way because after the war, when it was, not quite so popular to be anti-Semitic anymore, he was interviewed on British TV in the 60s, and he said, "No, I didn't hate all Jews. I just hated some Jews who were disrupting the international order." As if that's convincing from the leader of the British Union of Fascists who had Joseph Goebbels as the best man at his wedding, right? And so these people will do this kind of thing very often. Perhaps it's because they have to lie to themselves to get to sleep at night. That's quite plausible in my mind that that's why they have to do it. But if anyone's taken in by this, I honestly don't know what I can say to convince you. Perhaps you just need to do more research by yourself. But if you can't see it, then I can't see for you.
Um, we are pretty much out of time, but I want to comment on something Michael says in the chat. He says because it ties into something that James Valiant and I were talking about yesterday, and I was thinking about later. So Michael says Roger Waters is a big disappointment to me as an avid Pink Floyd fan, and we were talking yesterday about Charlotte Church, very talented anti-Semite, and and James was making the point that why are these artists talking and why should we listen to them? And I was thinking, and I usually agree with James, and you know he's not here, but he will be. So at some point we can discuss it. But I'm thinking, especially now in the age of social media, anybody can go online and say, okay, if you want to hear what I have to say, you follow me here, and then people do, and yeah, that's a there's no issue with that. There's the issue is with the content of what it is they're saying, and are they actually thinking the issues through? And of course, as Michael's comment suggests, you are hurting yourself in a way by doing so. Now, you're also hurting yourself if you're an artist and supporting Israel because you'll lose the support of people who hate Israel. Although, do you want them? That's a different question, but. Yeah, just wanted to make that comment. Now we're really out of time. Thank you, Morgan. Where can people find you?
You can find me at Morgan Carter 98 on Twitter. I've started tweeting regularly, and you can also find my Substack linked in the description.
You can't find my Substack in the description, but you can find me on Twitter as well. I'm at Razi Ginzberg. You can also find me on the reality show, which starts in a minute on this channel. We will be talking about Israel's Leni Riefenstahl, a title which I understand is problematic, and I think that's the first thing that's going to come up. Thank you, Morgan. We'll see you, I believe, tomorrow, or if not Thursday. We'll see you very soon on the channel.
Sometime soon.
Thanks. See you all in a minute. Bye.